Welcome to week 4 of our course, Transmission of the Light, an exploration of the Denkoroku by Keizan Zenji. This week we're going to be looking at 3 of the ancestors, and this particular teaching of the moment is about the teaching of the ancestor of Yunyan. Yunyan's teacher was Yaoshan. And however, he first studied with Baizhang for 20 years. So he had quite a lot of training before the encounter that is told at the beginning of his chapter here. And again, this is only the second case in which it's acknowledged that someone might practice with more than one teacher prior to realizing the Dhamma, to realizing their true nature. So Yunyan was practicing with Yaoshan, and he said, what else does Baizhang teach? So this was a method that he had been using with Yunyan, that Yaoshan was using with Yunyan. There's this method of asking him, what did Baizhang teach? And it is looking for Yunyan to actually begin to embody the teachings that he received from Baizhang, or to understand them, or to be able to express them in his own unique way. But instead, what he was doing was just repeating what he had heard at Baizhang's. So Yunyan does that in this case again. He says, once he, meaning Baizhang, went to lecture, and the assembly was standing there, and he dispersed them with his staff. He basically motioned for them to leave. So what does that mean? That's an indicator that you already have it. Your work is your work to do. There's nothing that I can say that would add a drop of wisdom to the wisdom which is already inherent in your life. Nonetheless, he realized that that might not be enough. So he called to them, hey, you, hey, guys, hey, folks. And when they turned their heads, he asked, what is it? What is it? And Yaoshan says, now I have been able to see Baizhang's teaching, Baizhang as a master, Baizhang as the full expression of Dhamma. So what is it that's being pointed out here? So actually we see it happening twice, but in particular, the one that's the most obvious is he calls them. He calls out to his students, hey, and they respond by turning their heads, by looking at him. That is the principle of call and response, of arising in response to the present moment condition of the cosmos. And that is happening all the time, and it is demonstrating, it is teaching the principles. And so that's why he says, what is it? What is it that makes it possible for us as human beings to be responsive to conditions in the present moment? What is it that is responding to itself, that is this great activity of ceasing and arising, and even within that, something which goes beyond that? So this is the question. What is it? What is it? That principle that is so pervasive, so innately part of us. So then we have a bit of the backstory. So we know that he'd practiced with Baizhang for quite a long time. Yunyan had. And even though Yaoshan tried to help him to understand some of the teachings of Baizhang that he shared, it wasn't working very well. He asks him about this statement that contains all flavors. What is the saying or the statement that contains all flavors? Yunyan had no reply. So sometimes silence is a way of replying, but in this case with Yunyan, it was more that he just didn't understand. So he didn't make an effort. He didn't make an attempt to try to say anything because he didn't know what to say. So then Yaoshan asks him, what can you do about birth and death before your eyes? So this is a very common teaching, a very common phrase within the Zen tradition, the great matter of birth and death, resolving the question of birth and death of an individual in general. This is the great matter to which we are attending when we practice. So Yaoshan asks him to consider what to do about birth and death. And Yunyan says, there's no birth and death before my eyes. So this could mean one of two things. It could mean that I don't really understand birth and death. I'm not really seeing birth and death in my own life. I still have a sense of continuity of this life, for example. That might be what he means. Or he might mean something about the birthlessness and deathlessness of all things. So this is a very, again, holistic teaching of Zen that we have seen over and over again, that if we understand, when we understand the non-separation of all things, including ourselves, then all things are in a mere state of transformation, and there's no, we couldn't put a stake at one end or another and define that as birth or death. So either way, it doesn't quite capture the teaching of Buddha Dharma, right? Because even to say that he understands conceptually this non-separation is not the same thing as having understood it viscerally, as having understood it as completely present right here in his own life. So Yaoshan doesn't approve of that. Then again, there are these other teachings, and again, we see this, trying these checking questions. And one thing that I wanted to say, that brings up a good point. One thing that I wanted to say is, in part in response to a question from Ashley in our previous discussion, and also just as a general resource for you as folks who might want to continue in your study of Zen. Anytime you have a question about a particular phrase or what a metaphor might mean, there are various resources for you to turn to. So as regards checking questions, for example, there is this very interesting, just lean over here and get this book. There is this very interesting appendix to the Cleary translation of the Blue Cliff Record. So the Blue Cliff Record is known in Japanese as Hekigan Roku. And Hekigan Roku is usually associated with the Rinzai school of Zen, more so than the Soto school of Zen. Nonetheless, you do have this very interesting on page 639, you have Fenyang's 18 types of questions. This list taken from a compilation called The Eye of Humans and Gods. And so there's various kinds of questions that are lifted up here, that are explained here, and some examples used so that we might begin to have a sense of what's happening in a particular dialogue, or how is it that someone is approaching the teaching with a particular question, whether it's the student or the master that presents the question. So other resources that you also might find is glossaries. So there are glossaries oftentimes in the back of all of these koan collections. And in particular, also in the Book of Serenity, this translation of the Book of Serenity is one of the most commonly used ones. So Book of Serenity is Shoyoroku. Shoyoroku is, as I believe I've said before, more typically a koan collection that's associated with Soto Zen school. This again is a Cleary translation, Thomas Cleary translation. And in the back, what he's done is this very interesting list of, so Book of Serenity is composed of 100 koans. And for each koan, Cleary has provided us with a brief explanation of certain basic phrases. So, for example, he says, 4 in the morning, 3 at night is a phrase that is used in the 6th koan about Mazu, who we saw in the previous chapter of Denkoroku. And it's a story about some monkeys. It's a story about monkeys being fooled by their keeper in a particular way. And so it's not a metaphor that you would know, particularly in the absence of having this bit of information that Cleary has shared with us. So you can find those notes beginning on page 431 of the Book of Serenity. So these are different ways of trying to suss out some information. Also, I mentioned the Sotoshu official translation has a number of footnotes. The Nishijima and Cross translation of Shobogenzo also has a tremendously helpful and voluminous set of footnotes that come with it. But we should also know that oftentimes, as we're seeing in this particular story with Yunyan, oftentimes these teaching phrases, whether they were novel or they were historical, didn't land. They didn't land at the time, even for people who had the contextual, the cultural context, the contextual moment of physical presence with this teacher, some years of practice, and so on. Sometimes it doesn't land. And other times it does. So it's just some encouragement for you, I suppose. So going on to finish here with Yunyan's story. At the top of page 142, Cleary translates Keizan Zenji's comment as, the meeting of the right circumstances doesn't depend on whether one is a novice or experienced. Pre-existing conditions are what cause it to be so. So he's saying, don't be fooled by one's seniority, by a person's seniority. That may or may not mean that they have a deep understanding of the Dhamma. These conditions, pre-existing conditions, or we could say the conditions that were present prior to the moment and that are in support of this moment, you could say, are what makes it come together. So those conditions are innumerable and hard to predict. So here's a statement on page 143, Keizan says, even if you understand that there is no birth and death, so again, potentially looking at Yunyan's statement about not seeing birth and death before his eyes as a description of his understanding of non-separation, even if you understand that and see that there is no self or others, right, non-separation, such a view does not perceive your own original head. You have not let go over the cliff. You have not fully entrusted yourself to a non-conceptual, experiential realization of such a thing. It's still what we would call a painted rice cake, a concept that doesn't nourish you in the same way. So, at the bottom of 143, Baizhang's dispersing his assembly is really about liberation and independence, right? It is about our freedom within this life. It is about our independence, meaning the fact that we can, by our own, by our own efforts, but because we are informed by Buddha nature, we can discover it. We don't need to rely on others. However, we often do benefit from teachings from others, and that's why Baizhang did relent and decide to call them back and demonstrate something. So we go to the poem. Without moving, the solitary boat sails ahead in the moonlight. As you look around, the reeds on the ancient bank have never moved. Now, this again is a situation where we see that Cook's translation is significantly different. Let's look at the Cook. Cook says, a solitary boat proceeds unaided in the bright moonlight. If you turn around and look, the reeds on the ancient shore do not sway. And both of these are very different from the Sotoshu interpretation or the Sotoshu translation of what happened there in this verse. So let me say this much. Here's how I understand it. I like the Cook translation in this case, actually, of this poem. A solitary boat, that's this, human life, body and mind, proceeds unaided in the bright moonlight. So that's Baizhang dispersing. And also sending Yunyan off, letting him go to visit with Yaoshan in the hopes of finding that perfect constellation of conditions that would open up the realization for him. If you turn around and look, right? So ultimately, Baizhang called, and his students turned around and looked. Ultimately, Yunyan also turned around and looked. So what do we mean by turn around? We mean, again, this way of turning the mind to investigate itself. Turning the mind to investigate its own experience. The reeds on the ancient shore do not sway. So once there is this completely integral this observation of the completely integral nature of things, then we are not swayed by the idea of separation anymore. And we understand ourselves to be always this continuous activity. So therefore, there's not anything new moving. It's merely as it has been, changing.